I'm Rob Hopwood. I'm planning partner in Bidwells, Cambridge, and really responsible for strategic planning opportunities and interest across the corridor. Just introducing our guests. Ben, I don't know whether or not you just want to say a little bit about who's joined us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Estelle Bailey is the Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust in Oxfordshire and across the Arc region. Estelle, thanks for joining us. You very kindly agreed to come and talk to us about your 100 Miles Wider initiative, which I think we're keen to hear more about. Andrew Taylor is Group Planning Director at Countryside. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Roland Bull is our Head of Rural Investment. Roland works with landowners across the Arc, including 15 Oxford colleges and the Wellcome Trust. And we've got Paul Leinster, Professor at Cranfield University, a member of the Natural Capital Committee, and also working across a number of initiatives on the Oxford Cambridge Arc. Thanks for joining us, Paul. Rob?
Yeah, now obviously the subject is all falling under the acutely active banner, as we call it, Unleashing the Arc. And of course, that's the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. In each of the series, we're going to look at a different aspect and how we can unlock this huge potential of the corridor. Next month, we're going to be asking about how to deliver housing and infrastructure at the scale imagined by the government. And after that, we'll look at how academia and science and technology has a key part to play in the Arc's future of our region, and setting about how to solve the world's greatest challenges. No full feat indeed. But in the first of this seminar, we're looking at nature, carbon and water, and how can we deliver green infrastructure on this same grand scale. The planning system, of course, has to reconcile the planned economic and residential growth planned across the corridor over the next 30 years. But yet we need to protect and increase natural capital, water resources and sustainable energy to turn the tide on climate change. We've assembled some of the region's bigger thinkers on the subject, and we hope to come up with a plan for this today from each of them and what needs to be done to deliver the size and scale the government is seeking. We would also ask whether or not relooking at the green belt across this region will best support the delivery of a green infrastructure plan for the region. So, we obviously want you to ask questions as we go, and we will obviously ask those at the right time. So obviously Paul's, Ben's introduced the guests. So what we'll do, we want to turn to Estelle first because she's on the screen. Estelle, you've said that the 100 Miles Wilder vision can demonstrate a new way of thinking about how places should be planned with nature and people's well-being at the centre of that. And I think the Combined Wildlife Trusts are calling for a strategic plan for the whole Arc instead of the current piecemeal approach. How are you going to go about doing that and delivering it?
That's a big question, Rob, isn't it? Ben, I'm just wondering, could you put up the map behind us so people can get a feel of the scale of what we're talking about?
There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think I've shrunk to super small now, haven't I? Yeah. Which is fine.
Don't worry about that. We can still hear and see you.
Okay, that's fine. Great. Okay. Thank you very much for having me today. It's great to come to be able to talk to you about our plans for the future and certainly this vision of what we would like to see happen across the Arc area. So I should probably say, first of all, why we did it, why we came up with this. And it was largely through concern, actually, that there was no plan, no coherent plan on the table, as it were. And when you're planning for the environment, and particularly on this kind of scale of development that we're talking about, and large infrastructure, you have to be able to test environmental limits to kind of tell you whether it's possible or not. And I think for us that was the overriding concern. And the piecemeal approach, you know, we've got multiple authorities here, we've got government wading in at the top, so it's very much, it feels like it's a top-down approach, but no substance to it with regards to the environment. And what it is not, and I should be clear about this, so our vision of what we would ideally like to see it's not there to facilitate growth. Let's just be clear about that. The whole idea is that we can stress test environmental limits for nature, for water, for carbon, and set out a new way of living. So if we do manage to overcome those barriers, and I suspect there are, because we know particularly around water, and we're probably going to talk a little bit more about that today, that, you know, there are barriers to getting water supplied there. That's already a water stressed area. So there's lots to consider in this, not just about nature, but for people's well-being, the way that homes are now developed, how they're designed, how they're developed, are they sustainable, is it low carbon? We're looking at trying to, you know, think through a completely different lens about how we create places for people to live. So for us, absolutely, we've you know, this is a major challenge now, but it is gaining traction. We launched this earlier on in the year and spoke to local decision makers about it. And particularly the ARC leaders, those are the people that we've been targeting in those groups, and it has gained traction. So this approach has actually gained traction. So we're delighted on many levels that now the environment has a platform. We've managed to give it a voice. So coming together with the RSPB and Woodland Trust and the Wildlife Trust generally, we've been able to kind of put a stamp down and say, look, if you're going to do it, this is what is possible across that area. And please, you know, use the guiding principles to stress test the limits. And we'll see what falls out of that. If we did actually apply those principles, it would give us the shape of what would be actually possible. At the moment, you know, we've got this 1 million homes, we've got potentially an expressway and everything else that goes with it. Is that really possible? Probably not. So that's our pitch to you, basically.
Okay, thanks. I know obviously the public have sort of reacted to the plan. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's got a mixed response, Rob. But, you know, if I'm completely honest, our supporters across the area, we've got 52,000 members altogether. So it's, you know, it's a significant chunk of the local population. And when there are other large infrastructure projects that are underway at the moment with the HS2 and, you know, everything else that's kind of coming at us, people are seeing the countryside as being carved up. So they're seeing it as sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And then when they hear about, you know, 1 million homes coming and everything else in an expressway, it just feels almost like it's the end of the world for a lot of people. So to see a plan coming forward from the local Wildlife Trust and other major NGOs, I think it took people by surprise, but it wasn't about that. It was never, we're giving into this, we're saying, that's okay, here's a license to develop. We're saying, look, you know, development is possible. Building with nature is possible, but here are the limits. Here are the tests that you need to put it through to be able to create it. It's not about us selling out. It's about us trying to do the right thing for nature.
And can I just ask, actually, what you're going to do next? How are you going to take it forward, and who you're going to try and bring with you in that message?
Yeah, well, we've been talking to the ARC leaders, as I mentioned before, and like I say, that the plan has gained traction, and it has now been included, the high-level principles have been included in the report that's gone back to government with the recommendations about how to proceed with this. So on many levels, we are delighted that that's the case. You know, we have actually our voice and our approach has been heard, and now that's being reflected back to government. The local authorities like it as well, and we're working now on various committees to bring the plan to life. So it really feels like it could happen, actually.
Okay, that's good. Well, we'll come back to that a bit later. I'd like to turn to Paul next. Paul's obviously got various roles. And Paul, I understand you've been looking at the policy changes that might need to be made to deliver on this vision. So I'm sure you've got some ideas on what needs to happen next. So what's the sort of first step that we'd need to take?
Okay, thanks, Rob. And as Estelle was saying, there's a lot going on in this space, and there's also considerable uncertainty around it all. So we've got the 25-year plan, the environment and agriculture bills, the new planning proposals. There are concepts such as net environment gain, net biodiversity gain, net zero, natural capital, ecosystem services, public goods for public money, all of which need to land in some way. And within the ARC itself, there's the economic prospectus, which has just been produced. And there's then talk about a spatial framework. But the spatial framework has been being talked about for quite a while. And we haven't yet seen it, and we don't know whether or not, for example, the planning policies within it are going to be material planning considerations across the ARC, and how does all of this interface with other things which are being talked about, like local nature recovery strategies, the environmental land management system to take over from CAP, and then also when it comes to the housing and other development, how does that fit into local spatial plans? And again, the local spatial plans are at different stages. So one of the things that has come out of the local national capital plan work that we've been doing in the ARC is it's clear that there's a need for shareable and agreed baseline data, which is all based on common standards and is publicly and freely accessible. That's a challenge. And that baseline data needs to cover natural capital, the ecosystem services, the constraints and risks, as Estelle was talking about, and also the opportunities. And within that, to make those baseline maps work, we need an agreed baseline. You can't talk about net gain unless you know where you're starting from. So for both net biodiversity gain and net environment gain, we need an agreed baseline with all of the data collected in the 1 year. But we also need to agree what time in the past we're going from. Otherwise, we've lost time if within this overall context, which is, this is to be the first generation to leave the environment in a better state. So what are the methodologies and approaches that we have for net biodiversity and net environment gain? And there needs to be an agreed methodology and approach for those. And then you need an agreed governance around it. Because I think that for some of the propositions going forward to local planning committees, I think one of the ways that this could be done is to have a governance which sits outside that, which tests whether or not it truly is the baseline and whether the propositions coming forward are workable and the most appropriate. And then they could advise the planning committee. But trying to get every planning committee up to speed on how you assess baseline and net gain, I think is a challenge beyond. Then finally, one of the things that we've called for from the National Capital Committee is that there is a comprehensive environmental census that is undertaken every 5 years in the country. Because we need this information going forward to see whether or not we are actually delivering against what we said we would deliver, but also we need, as I said earlier, this clear baseline.
Paul, that's great. Can I just ask, with all your various hats on, which authority or, shall we say, body might take the responsibility or initiative to help set what the baseline would be? Because obviously there's lots of interest from different areas, but you'd probably need someone to take control of it. So who do you think that might be?
Well, I think in terms of the versions for both baseline, net gain, both net gains, biodiversity and environment, and also the net zero calculation, which also has to come into this, I think that has to be DEFRA. This has to be a nationally agreed approach, and they need to set it so that it becomes the agreed way of doing it, but they also need to involve a wide group in establishing what that approach should be.
Oh, that's great, Paul. So Roland, turning to you, it's sort of a natural thing, really. You work and advise on developers and how they can meet their biodiversity obligations, and also work with landowners to deliver solutions. So what scale are we currently working to generally, and how are we going to ramp this up at this scale that obviously the wildlife trusts are envisaging? Is Roland on?
Sorry, I'm just struggling to find the mute. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so as Ben said earlier, my main role is actually advising institutional investors, large institutional landowners. But having studied ecology as an undergraduate, I've been involved in advising various parties on strategic habitat creation initiatives associated with large development sites for a number of years now. And you said, we're certainly doing a lot of work for developers and landowners, but also for conservation NGOs. And so our clients include a number of wildlife trusts. We're advising Berks, Bucks and Oxon on various issues, and Beds, Cams and North Hants we do a lot of work with. We're working currently with Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, which is really sort of the home of biodiversity offsetting, and have had it adopted as a key part of policy for several years now. But in terms of the projects we're currently working on, we are currently working towards the delivery of some really, really significant habitat creation initiatives. And I say habitat creation, I mean, these are initiatives that will deliver a very broad range of environmental benefits. So green infrastructure in its broadest sense, carbon sequestration function, flood attenuation, and public amenity, and particularly biodiversity. There is this debate, and it's a very relevant one, as to striking the appropriate balance between immediate accessibility to nature from developments and the health and well-being benefits that brings. And I do think that's incredibly important. But my personal interest is in significant, regionally important conservation initiatives, and the opportunity that recent policy developments provide to fund those really important conservation initiatives at a strategic scale. And some of the ones we're working on at the moment already are involving many, many millions of pounds, some hundreds of acres of land in some instances, and creating very high quality habitats which will be managed and will be funded over the very long term, to secure appropriate forms of management. So as I say, the process definitely has this huge potential to support some of the great work that these conservation bodies are already doing in the region. The point that other panelists have already made about the strategic planning is absolutely critical. This principle of nature recovery, local nature recovery strategies and networks, and that spatial planning. I mean, I know it's something, Rob, that you sort of always bang the drum about, having an overarching delivery body for the ARC. I think you and I have discussed before, I forget the number, but there's something like 16 planning authorities if you count all the county councils and unitary authorities across the ARC. And interesting, I mean, there's 2 wildlife trusts, covering that entire area, and their knowledge, of that area and ability to deliver, as I say, conservation initiatives, on that scale is unparalleled. So to me, as I say, it's this fantastic opportunity, to help support some of that great work. I think one of the things that will really, deliver a step change in this is as the policy requirement for BNG really bites, and we're already working towards, as I say, some very large schemes where they're being developed in anticipation of a policy requirement, either at a national or local level, coming about before an application is determined. But as I say, I think one of the things that will really, push this forward is the participation of investors in the market. And it's something we've talked a lot about, say, that, this is the sort of traditional institutions that we're acting for in managing, rural investment portfolios. And I think they are uniquely placed to support the work. I mean, at the moment, the only really investable proposition is land, because typically where a developer is paying a sum to deliver, say a fund a conservation initiative or a habitat creation scheme, that is paid at the point at which they're effectively acquiring those conservation credits. So the money is available at that point to actually undertake the physical work necessary to implement that program and deliver the ongoing management. What is actually necessary before that is to secure the land. And the truth is that those conservation bodies aren't, they don't have huge balance sheets. They're not, enormously well funded. And actually, as I say, that potential for a partnership between institutional investors and those conservation NGOs that have the knowledge and resources to actually deliver this on the ground, that has enormous potential. And as I say, combined with a proper spatial framework and some strategic planning that identifies those areas with the greatest biodiversity opportunity and greatest potential, could unlock some quite special things in the region.
Rowan, that's great. Thanks for that, because that leads really nicely on. If I can turn to Andrew, I'd like to be the first to raise it, because obviously it was in the poster advertising this webinar. What about the Greenbelt? Obviously, does it currently help try and meet the purpose of what the 100 Miles Wilder initiative is setting out to do? Is it getting in the way? From a developer's perspective, Andrew, what can you say about that?
Well, thanks for the nice, easy question, Rob. I suppose in terms of Greenbelt, though, it's not just about what a developer thinks or necessarily the local authority or even the Wildlife Trust we were talking about and the different perspectives. It's about saying, well, what are we trying to achieve at the end of that strategic plan? And I completely agree with the other panelists. We need a strategic plan for the whole arc that is going to be able to set that strategy and that structure for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's it. Really imperative to be able to deliver the things that Estelle was talking about, while also delivering the homes and the economic development that is going to be necessary. And to be able to do that with fixed constraints that we can't even touch, like the Greenbelt, is just not going to work. I mean, we already know that certainly, at both ends, we're going to have new railway lines, new roads going through the Greenbelt, opening up new areas for development. And actually, when we're talking properly about strategic development and sustainable development, just pick the Cambridge end for a moment, the new Cambridge South Station, is it really going to sit in perfect isolation with no development around it on the southern fringe, with only the development to the north into Cambridge? Or is it going to be part of a properly planned extension to Cambridge, which picks up all the issues that we've talked about up till now? And if we don't grasp that nettle and deal with it through that proper strategic planning, we're never going to achieve all the aims we need to do. If we're going to deliver the 1.2 million houses we need to do and the economic development that the ARC has the potential for, we need to think properly and coherently about it with a policy-off approach about how we're going to deliver that, and then start to put on all these aspirations that we've been talking about, but all the others the government are talking about, all the things about design, energy efficiency, water efficiency, the broader sustainability impacts, because that's a whole package we need to consider rather than all the different bits in isolation. And if we take that and say, well, actually, the best place to build is in the Greenbelt, or not, it might be somewhere else, well, that's the answer, and that's the decision we need to take. And it might not be my piece of land, it might be somebody else's piece of land, but that's not quite the point. It's about thinking through that properly over the entire arc. But I worry at the moment that we don't have that coherence across the arc. We have a plethora of different councils, as you've been mentioning. We have a council leaders group, which starts to provide some of that senior leadership. But we've already had, just this week, I think, one of the councils, or just after the council's joint ARC brochure was launched, pulling out. We've now got a big hole in the middle of it, in theory, where one council wants to go it alone. Well, that doesn't quite work. You can't remove yourself from a geography just because you politically think that's the best thing to do. You are part of this, whether you want to be or not. And that's the problem we have when we don't have that broader strategic planning in the current system, and there isn't one in the new white paper system, and duty to cooperate goes, but we need that proper coherence to respond, or otherwise we won't get the investment from government to invest in the infrastructure, which will start to unlock the potential that we have. And I mean, just going back to the 100 Miles Wilder, without all the investment from the infrastructure and the new developments, we're not going to be able to deliver those things. We're not going to be able to unlock the potential and the investment into those key things that Estelle set out, and those aspirations there. And I'm sure there are aspirations that all developers, all local councils can buy into, providing there is clarity and certainty about what's going to be provided, and we have a consistent approach across the council boundaries.
And that's very helpful, thanks. I'm just wondering, from, you know, there'll be a few developers and promoters patching into this. Do you think this 100 miles wilder plan might be a problem or cause a bit of difficulty for landowners, developers and promoters? Because my viewing of the plan itself, and I think the principles behind it are very good. It sounds like a planner's been helping write it. But I would also say that there's a green coverage across the whole plan. There's no white zones on that map. And it looks like green's been coloured in from Oxford to Cambridge. Do you see any sort of problems, difficulties created by that?
Challenges, there we go. There are different shades of green on that map, though, aren't there? Different shades of green, which allow, and I did put the link in the chat, so I think it's useful for everyone to have a look. It's more about having the clarity early on in the process. If you know what you're planning for, you can respond to it. There's always going to be issues with one piece of land being in a very dark green area, which says no development at all, and other land which is in a lighter green bit or hatched area, which says you can do something as long as it's, you know, thought through carefully, would be my paraphrase. And therefore you can respond appropriately to it. There's always going to be winners and losers, but generally it's about the certainty and clarity early on, but that consistent, coherent approach across the whole area. And that's what's going to enable us all to respond appropriately to these sorts of challenges.
Oh, that's great. So Ben, are there any questions coming in for our panelists that seem to follow on from each of them have said?
You're on mute, Ben.
Oh, it's the constant.
That's the thing I told everybody not to do, and then I did it. Roland, this is for you. This is from it's Al Corey. I assume it's Alistair Corey from University of Oxford. Roland, do you feel optimistic that many of the investors you're working with genuinely have an interest in the green infrastructure investment scene?
Yes, categorically. I mean, I've had a call, in fact, this morning between a big institutional landowner and one of the other wildlife trusts that I act for, talking about exactly this. You know, it is going to happen, and it's going to happen quite soon. Not simply because, and it's a you know, a nice, warm, fuzzy thing to be investing in, but actually the financial returns are there. You know, certainly in the early part, as this market establishes, you know, these initiatives that we're working on at the moment, it is justified where you're doing things at enormous scale to deliver a bespoke solution to provide net gain in connection with the development. You know, where you've got smaller developments, actually the transactional costs associated with that and the risks and delays are such that you're just simply not able to achieve the same thing with the resource that is available. I mean, if you look at the value that is attributed through the development process to ecological gain relative to the cost of let's say education, health provision in a typical development, it's tiny. And so actually, if you can collect that resource together and as I say, pool it, you know, to deliver strategic conservation initiatives, and then do that not only more meaningfully, you know, realizing Lawton principles, bigger, better, more joined up, but you can do it far more cost effectively and efficiently, and therefore, you know, create the conservation credits more efficiently, and you know, there is economic value in that. You know, you can then sell them at a premium. So as I say, it is a financially attractive proposition, you know, for those investors to be participating in the market.
Well, that's good to know. Ben, any other questions?
Yeah, this is from Guy Caddish. I suspect that most developers would be very happy to contribute and help deliver these ambitions as part of a development scheme delivery, especially if this helps bring early certainty to the ecological mitigation and enhancement. What mechanism can be put in place to deliver this through individual planning authorities dealing with these individual schemes? Who's that one for? I'm not sure, Rob.
Yeah, that I think obviously perhaps Estelle or Paul might be able to come back on that.
I'm happy to go first and then Estelle. I think what you need is clarity on the policy. And if there's clarity on the policy, then there's clarity on the delivery. So that's what we need. And we need to work out how this then gets expressed through local plans. It'll be interesting to see in some of the planning developments that are coming through, where certainly on certain sizes of developments, some of this is being bypassed in a way or brought up front, depending on how you want to look at it, with a clarity on what this is going to mean. So I think that, for me, is key. Just to, if I might, just to touch on, and Roland and I have had many discussions about this before, and I think it's going to be a continuing one. So for me, if a development comes forward, then we need to be looking at the avoid, minimize, remediate, compensate, invest and maintain aspects. And what I don't want to see is local developments coming forward, which are places that people really wouldn't want to live in because they're not well designed, there isn't access to green space, but the developer is able to say, but it's okay because I've delivered this 20 miles away. Now, I think we need to be able to divide the remediate and certainly the minimize and remediate then to get us to a net zero on the site itself. Then when you come to that truly invest part, then you might do that remotely. But I think we need to be really clear about the sorts of developments that are being developed. And you won't get the benefits of recreation, health and well-being, mental benefits that you get through publicly accessible green space if all development, I know this isn't what Roland believes, all of that investment happens somewhere remotely. And if it's going to happen remotely, what about the Highlands? Is what this is.
I'm just going to jump in very quickly. Sorry, Estelle.
No.
Paul and I do very much broadly agree on that. I mean, the only point I'd just add is where policy currently permits and recognises value in green and brown roofs, it does have value, but it is a very difficult balance to strike. The accessibility to natural green space is absolutely critical. And I think there should be an expectation placed on all developments to deliver that in the same way as there is to satisfy, the requirements of healthcare and education provision, for example. But, as you say, where you are delivering a net uplift, I think that, you can achieve more on a strategic level by pooling resources rather than, as I say, by delivering things that, aren't going to be truly sustainable in the very long term in terms of securing appropriate forms of management that are, financed through service charges, administered to management companies and things like that. It has a role, but, we need to be more ambitious in terms of what we can achieve and what Estelle can achieve on a more strategic level.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just come in there, Rob? I think for me, the starting point is trying to determine what is possible. So we're going to flip it on its head and not just assume we're going to be developing at whatever kind of scale. We've got to determine what is possible first. So really getting stuck into that stress testing and doing environmental assessments, which will then allow us to plan and determine what is possible for that area. So, I'm not saying we can't do it, but I'm just saying let's plan effectively, do it from the bottom up. And come up with something that we know is absolutely possible and can be delivered.
That's great, Estelle. Thanks for that. I just want to get a question.
Can I just come in and just make a quick point?
I was going to come into you, Andy. Then. Go
on then.
No. You make the point. Yeah.
I think there's a difference though in scale of development. Because actually, if you think about something like the natural and district level licensing, that's a good way of some schemes being able to off-site and improve habitats for biodiversity in certain areas. And it's the same with natural green space. Actually, development of 50 homes, for example, it might not be the best use of that percentage of open space to provide it within that site. But a development of 1,000 homes, it's important to have that integrated with it. And actually, from a developer's perspective, that adds value, it adds character, it adds interest to that site as well. So there are different approaches I think we need to have in different areas. Sorry, Rob.
Well, no, you've answered it in a way. I was just wondering if you've got any big sites, which we know you have out there, especially in the Arc, where nature seems to be an issue. And do you see it changing emphasis? And have you got any good case examples that you're working on at the moment?
Well, I suppose the one that comes to mind is Bourne Airfield in South Cambs, and we've been working with the Wildlife Trust there, looking at the particular issue of biodiversity net gain and the amount of space required, the metrics, trying to understand what's there and how you improve that, taking into account all the other requirements of a piece of grass mown to the end of its life for a sports pitch versus a slightly more bio-rich part of the landscaping. And it's that balance between the different types of uses, the accessibility of those, but also linking in to the broader footpath network within the local area, thinking about those connections and how you can improve some of those to actually give people access to that, even if it's not directly on your site.
Excellent. Well, that's good. That's what I wanted from you there. Can I just ask, Ben, are there any, we've probably got one more question, because I've got a couple of questions. Is there any one more out there?
Yeah, we got a couple on the expressway, which is reported on the BBC this morning. I'll come back to that. That's just a warning for you, Estelle. I think we'll probably come to you on that one. But there's a follow-up here from Alistair Corey. Shades of green seems to be a better starting place than shades of grey. So the challenge is to bring green infrastructure even into already very dense urban areas as a great way of looking at our broad communities, making our broad communities fit for the future. However, do we feel the current strategic planning in the ARC is focused enough on really good brownfield opportunities rather than creating a lot of quick fit new conurbations?
Yeah, I do have an opinion on that, but somebody else is probably better off answering.
No, go on, Estelle, please.
No, yeah, I mean, I caught the tail end of that, but yeah, I mean, I understand that it's cheaper to build from new, so kind of take over a field and whatever, but really part of the principles of this should be looking backwards to probably into existing brownfield sites and existing developments and seeing what might be possible there first as a kind of the first place that you look. And I guess that then kind of just leads to the whole question around the green belt, and one thing that we would be calling for as part of this, and the Wildlife Trust talked about it recently, is something called Wild Belt. So looking at a kind of new designation for nature in all of this. So yeah, fine, let's have a conversation about the green belt and how that could be better for wildlife, but actually going further and saying, well, let's have a look and wrap up some wild belt in there as well. So we really do get the protection for nature that we need in these fragmented landscapes.
Great.
And I think, just for me, it's interesting, there's the current strategic planning. So just a question, is there current strategic planning at the ARC level? I don't think there is. The strategic planning that's going on is very much at a local council by council level. And I think that there is a real challenge around how you bring together the linear infrastructure that's going in and being talked about, together with the housing developments, and what the optimum arrangement for all of those, together with natural capital and natural environment infrastructure in the place, and what's the overview. So I think one of the key pieces that we do need is what this strategic framework or strategic vision is. Yeah. And then how does that get expressed in planning policy?
Paul, that's great. It's our understanding that there are at high government levels thoughts on the strategic plan for the ARC. Obviously, it's taking some time because we know that coronavirus and perhaps Brexit are ahead of it, obviously in the government's thought processes. But I just wanted to ask each of you a final question, really, before I do a bit of summing up. What do you feel needs to happen next for this 100 Miles Wilder initiative to actually be delivered? What's the key important action that needs to be taking place first? So if I come to Estelle first, we'll go in order.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I mean, for me, bigger picture, we're in a nature and climate crisis. So number one, kind of that has to be surely the organising principles of any response we make to this and any plans that we have going forward. I've mentioned about assessments before. If we can overcome that, then obviously there would clearly be concerns, but actually we wouldn't stand in the way But we need that plan. And I think, you know, we keep having to come back to this all the time. You know, governments, whoever, please put a plan on the table that's coherent, that deals with all of these issues. You know, we want to see a landscape that is thriving, where there's wildlife, where there's connectivity, fragmentation is dealt with. We want really good biodiversity net gain standards. We want sustainable housing. We want to plan the way that people move around that area, looking at sustainable transport. You know, and people's lives are better for living in a development of that kind of scale. So we want the best that we can. So, you know, our ask is for government to please stand up and put something on the table.
Thank you. So, Paul, would you come back now?
Yep, thank you. Building on that, I think we need clarity on the policy, both at a national and at an ARC level. We need the agreed baseline data. We need the agreed methodologies. I think we need to be delivering net environment gain, building on net biodiversity gain, but net environment gain, not just net biodiversity gain. And that net gain needs to apply to all development, both national level development, not just the development being covered by town and country planning. We need agreed governance at the different scales to enable this to happen. And then one just final plea, which is more in line with one of your future webinars, and that's when you're looking at housing. As chair of BPHA, one of the major housing associations in the ARC, please don't forget social housing and the role that social housing has to play within that discussion and the delivery of this agenda going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That will be in the next webinar, no doubt, that issue. Roland, over to you. What needs to happen?
So, I mean, it's been said already multiple times, but to me, the most critical thing is the strategic spatial planning. You know, actually identifying which land, you know, is best placed to deliver development, and which land, you know, alongside that is best placed to deliver biodiversity benefits and wider, as Paul says, you know, very much wider environmental benefits. And then following on from that, better integration of land use policies generally. And that's really critical, the various forms of funding that will flow to, you know, land managers and occupiers from you know, public grant schemes to the environmental land management scheme that's going to replace basic agricultural subsidy, and these new forms of revenue from private sector. So whether that's biodiversity net gain, or even you know, land use change to you know, for carbon sequestration initiatives. But you know, it all needs to be brought together.
Thanks, Roland. That's great. And Andrew, can you have a final word from a developer's perspective on what needs to happen next?
Yes, thank you. Roland's just nicked my bit about we need a proper spatial plan, but that needs to be one, I think, that's sponsored by government and links up the transport infrastructure as well, and provides that regional level, though, while allowing each individual local authority to put the flesh on the bone and the detail. There was a question that just popped up that has disappeared, I think, about from Colin Armstrong, or a point about the clarity of policy, or the lack of clarity in policy. And that's really important. We're never going to get any of these initiatives or any improvement across the ARC or anywhere else if we don't have the clarity of policy at a national or local level that achieves that. And picking up on the comment from Al Corey, that's strategic leadership as well. A range of local authority leaders, even if they don't change every 4 years, but sometimes they do, or in between that as well, has no longevity in terms of the delivery of this sort of level of infrastructure investment and clarity of vision. So we need to tie all those things together to give me and people like me the certainty to invest, the clarity to know what we need to do, to be able to prepare the plans to respond to all those policies, so that we know what we're doing, and that collectively we can move forward and deliver high quality development that fits the needs of the future population.
That's great, Andrew. Thanks for that. So what I'm going to try and do now is attempt to sum up basically a plan of action from what you've all said. So I've been making notes, and I've got them in order. I'll put them in an order here. It might be slightly out, but number one is actually what is possible. What is possible first in terms of what this 100 miles wider means, and is it actually practical and possible? The second thing is to set a clear policy. That's obviously fundamental. We all want that. Everyone wants that. So we all know where we stand. And that provides, in turn, early certainty, which is what everybody wants. I mean, landowners, public, developers, promoters, they want to know what they're dealing with. And that's all set through clear policy. But really, fundamentally, to help that, you need to agree the governance of this, who's in charge, and provide the leadership, which was obviously mentioned there as well, which is very important. That goes with governments. Who's in charge, who's making the decisions, who's running it. Of course, the strategic plan is mentioned many times, and that seems to be very fundamental to this. We're talking at a strategic scale in any case. But at the end of the day, why are we doing this? What is it all about? Why has the 100 Miles Wilder scheme been initiated? Well, at the end of the day, it's to provide real benefits. I mean, we wouldn't be doing all this and setting policy and delivering it if there weren't any real benefits at the end. And what seems to have come across today is it's all about sustainable environmental benefits, which then lead to health and well-being advantages for us all. So not only we are protecting the environment through development in some initiatives, but also what are we getting out of it at the end of the day. So actually it all sounds very simple, but you know, on a day-to-day basis, politics and planning and everything else is very complicated, and it'd be very nice to be able to cut through it. But thank you very much, panelists today. I think you've really helped. I think we know where we're going and where we want to go. So I think that really sums up very nice, but just really to thank everyone and also all the participants who have taken on interest in this today and their questions. So I think actually, Ben, you're going to just share on the screen what's coming up next.
That's right, yeah, a couple of dates for everybody's diaries. The next webinar will be on November the 25th. But that's where we'll be talking directly to development industry. We're hoping that we will have a senior representative from CLG to talk about how that spatial plan is coming along. And then we've got another session in the new year where we'll be talking to some of the science and technology businesses who are expanding at a rapid rate currently across the ARC, and also how they best work alongside academia to really maximise all of the benefits that Rob just talked about. So we will be making sure that people know who the speakers are and the joining details for those sessions. So we do hope that everybody here today can join us for those too.
Yep, get them in the diary.
Absolutely.
So thanks everyone, all the best. I'll see you again on the other side.